Welcome to the Cornell Cooperative Extension Dairy Herd Health Troubleshooting Podcast, a podcast series focused on how to go about looking into health issues on a dairy. Each episode will discuss a different area on the dairy where herd health can be impacted. This series has less to do with providing answers to problems. We'll be talking about how to be more successful in your investigations.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final episode of Troubleshooting Herd Health Issues. In this last episode, we are going to touch on dry cow management. So we know that the dry cow is going to get through the dry period just fine, but it's after this period that potential issues could arise and she may be a train wreck. So in this episode, we are going to discuss risk factors in the dry period and how to minimize these risks and maximize success once cows freshen. My name is Casey Havekes. I am one of the dairy management specialists on the North Country Regional Ag Team. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Tom Overton, who is the department chair, a professor of animal science, and the director of Pro Dairy at Cornell University. So thank you, Tom, for joining me today, and I'll pass it over to you if you want to introduce yourself and your research program a little bit further.
Yeah, hey, Casey, thanks for having me. And again, really glad to have you as part of our extension team here in New York. So the transition cow and the dry cow focus has been a thing now for probably 25 years. And I was lucky to get on to that early on with both my research and extension programs. And as you know, based on your work, it's kind of the gift that keeps on giving, right? Because you certainly are adding to our knowledge there, and we'll talk about some of that in a little while. So, I think it still is a focal point at the farm level, right? In fact, even this week, I've had several conversations with dairy producers, with nutritionists, with veterinarians about, again, opportunities and challenges that they've had on their farms. And I think overall as an industry, and our field data would support this, I think we're doing better, but still we still have opportunity out there to continue to keep fine-tuning transition cow management.
Yeah, so Tom, one of the areas that I think has received a lot of attention in that past 25 years that you mentioned is the body condition during the dry period. So what we're targeting at dry off, but then also what we're targeting at freshening. Are you able to touch a little bit on the recommendations for target body condition scores during the dry period?
Yeah, I think one of the things we still kind of hold on to is wanting those cows to dry off at around a 3 1/4. Hopefully not too much different than that, either lower or higher, and ideally not neither gain nor lose body score during the dry period. And we'll talk more about energy and diets here in a little bit, but that's where some of the emphasis on controlled energy diets has kind of come into play, where we just want to we really don't want that cow significantly gaining body condition score. Now, post-calving, we want them to lose no more than about half to 2/3 of a body score. And our high-producing herds actually, they do that. So you can put those management packages together to do that. Certainly, we know if we have cows that are over-conditioned, 375, 4 and greater, they're certainly more at risk for excessive body condition loss, post-calving, and kind of all the things that come along with that relative to metabolic issues, et cetera.
So if producers aren't able to achieve that target body condition score of 3.25 at dry off, what would you recommend for those cows to make sure that they're able to get through the dry period and through freshening without problems?
Yeah, I think in those cases, I think it's even more important to keep those energy levels down, especially for far off cows. Because, depending on how long they're dry, they're on that diet for 40 days, give or take, and so keeping the energy levels down, I think is even more important if we have overconditioned animals coming through the system. I think the other side, not all dairies can do this very effectively, but, also giving those, for dairies that have access to some pasture or outdoor space, actually giving those animals some exercise, right, and kind of trying to take some body condition off in a more physically fit way, perhaps, can make sense. I wouldn't try to take weight off of them by feeding them under requirements. So I think we still probably want to maintain it about where they're at, and just know we're going to have some high risk animals coming through.
Yeah, that's a really good point about grazing some of those dry cows if they have the opportunity to do so. So you also touched on energy. So we know that these controlled energy dry cow diets have become quite popular, especially in the last 10 years or so. So are you able to touch on some of the dietary characteristics of these dry cow diets in terms of energy, protein, DCAD levels, and some of those other nutritional factors that play an important role?
Yeah, sure. And again, I think that the big thing, again, we'll talk about grouping systems later, and I do prefer two-group dry cow systems overall, recognizing that may not be the best solution for each farm, given what they have from a facilities, number of cows standpoint, other things that relate to abilities to deliver well-mixed diets in those groups. But, far off cows, we really just want to keep the energies down. We want to, usually that means dietary starch, under 13% or so. Usually that means lower energy haylage. So haylage that they let get a little bit mature to maybe feed to far off cows and pregnant heifers at the farm level. Could mean straw or dry hay chopped into the TMR to decrease energy densities. Close up, I tend to like to feed a little more energy, a little more starch to those cows, maybe in the 17 to 18% range to kind of get them ready for a lactating diet. The other part of that is I think that also helps meet the needs of both heifers and cows in that prepartum period. We also like to focus our protein supplementation more on the rumen undegradable or rumen bypass sources, try to get that metabolizable protein supply up close up to those cows. And then calcium management is really important. And that really starts with the prepartum diet and, DCAD or decreasing the dietary cation anion difference by, reducing high potassium feeds close up, and potentially coming in with anionic supplements, before calving. That's a tested and true approach. There are also essentially binders of calcium that are on the market as well that can actualize a low calcium diet. So now we have a couple different approaches that we can use to optimize calcium in those fresh cows, because hypocalcemia really is even for farms that don't have clinical milk fever issues, hypocalcemia, subclinical hypocalcemia is a meaningful issue. Now, Casey, I'm going to turn the tables on you a little bit here because, we can talk about my diet formulation all day long on paper, but what really matters is what's actually getting in front of the cows. And so your work that you did during your master's is really interesting relative to having some work in terms of how these diets truly should be fed at the farm level. And can you go into that a little bit for our audience?
Yeah, definitely. So my master's work was done at the University of Guelph under the supervision of Dr. Trevor DeVries. And what we were trying to do was see what we could do from a feeding management perspective to try to maximize intake of these high straw or these controlled energy dry cow diets to really minimize that drop in intake as cows approached calving, and then also maximize health post-calving. So we did this through 3 studies. We looked at the chop length of the straw. So we fed a 1-inch particle size and a 4-inch particle size. In a separate study, we looked at decreasing the moisture content by adding water, and we wanted to decrease it by about 10 percentage points so that we are making the dry cow diet more similar to the lactating diet that cows were used to consuming in terms of the dry matter level. And then in a third and final study, we looked at adding molasses to the diet. So I guess overall, I think it's really important that we minimize sorting during this period. And we saw that that was possible through minimizing the forage particle size to that 1-inch level. So we really want to make sure that cows aren't given the opportunity to sort during the dry period. And I think that maybe it's not perceived too much of a risk during the dry period because they're usually fed these higher forage diets, these higher fiber diets. So the risk of acidosis is going to be a little bit lower. But I think based on the work that we did and what we saw with these cows, it is really important to minimize that risk so that they don't carry that behavior over after calving once the risk of acidosis is higher. And then not only that, when we minimize sorting, we're ensuring that cows are consuming a balanced diet. And that's going to be especially important when we're feeding products like DCAD supplements that are going to be, found in the fine fraction or the short fraction of the diet. So we want to make sure that cows are able to consume all of the nutrients that are intended for them.
If I remember right, both decreasing that straw chop length to that 1 inch or so, and I think your dry matter on your water addition work was about 45%, correct? Is that what it was?
Yep, that's right.
Both those scenarios, didn't those cows maintain better intakes during that whole time?
Yeah, so that was a really interesting thing that we saw. So cows not only had higher intake across the entire dry period, but they were able to maintain higher intake in that week leading up to calving. So the cows that were fed the shorter particle size, the cows that were fed the water diet, and the cows that were fed the molasses diet all maintained higher intake compared to the other treatment groups. And they actually had a steeper decline in that week leading up to calving. So we know from some previous work looking at feeding behavior that if we're able to allow those cows to maximize intake in the dry period, and particularly in that week leading up to calving, then they're going to be at lower risk of experiencing metabolic disease after calving. So that was a really interesting finding in the research that we did. And I think that's really important for producers to consider moving forward.
Yeah, again, I think it's great to have actual some real research and data in that area. I mean, I think that nutritionists and others, people like me, have been trying to emphasize those points with herds for some time, right? The importance of the chop length, chopping it before, ideally pre-chopping it, and using it as an ingredient, right? The TMR to be more consistent. My students love teasing me about my fondness for chopping straw and hay and things like that. But it makes a big difference, and it's great to have some data that you've contributed there. So
yeah, it definitely does. Oh, thank you.
No, you're good.
It really does make a difference. And the one thing that I'll add to that is when we're feeding diets that we're really trying to maximize the intake, and Tom, you touched on this earlier, we don't want to restrict the animal's nutrient intake, so we don't want to be under their requirements, but we really want to make sure that if we're trying to promote intake, that we're not trying to promote excessive nutrient intake. So feeding a diet that is going to meet their energy requirements but not surpass it in a great quantity is really important. And that's going to be particularly important in the far off period, as you mentioned, Tom. So for farms that are feeding groups of dry cows that are grouped in close up and far off versus one group, I think that's also really important to consider. And maybe, Tom, you could touch a little bit on how cows should be grouped during this period and nutritional considerations for that.
Yeah. And again, just to reiterate, I mean, I think, in an ideal world, right, I think we'd have 2 group dry cow systems with low energy, far off diets, higher energy, higher protein, DCAD and or calcium binder, pre-fresh diets or close-up diets, really get those cows off to a good start. But, there's still lots of dairies where that's not really a feasible option. And so, oftentimes a one group TMR for that dry period is probably maybe the best choice for a dairy. And in those cases, what I usually do is we kind of split the difference on energy. We'll maybe run 14 or 15% starch in those diets. Maybe not push the protein quite as hard if we're going for a full dry period. I don't have any issues doing DCAD or anionic diets for a full dry period. Might not be quite as aggressive. We've been pretty aggressive with them close up, targeting urine pHs down toward 5.5. And, maybe we'll let those be up at 6 or a little over if we're doing the one group. The one thing I don't think I would do, because I'm not aware of any data on it, is nobody to my knowledge has really fed the calcium binder as a calcium management approach for an entire dry period. And so I would probably not do that in one group dry without at least some information suggesting that we know what that does for a longer period of time. But again, it's going to come back to what's the right opportunity for that farm. What are they going to implement well, right? Again, based on their mixer and batch sizes, cow numbers, because a lot of cases, if you gave me the choice between a poorly implemented two group system, my bad, and a well implemented one group, the farm may get the better outcome from a well implemented one group system. So it just comes back to the farm and what's going to fit them best.
And so, Tom, you touched on this a couple of times. So for producers that maybe are not aware of the difference, could you quickly touch on the difference between anionic supplements and calcium binders?
Yeah, no, that's great, Casey. So for years, right? Really, our only tool in the toolbox was anionic diets, right? Anionic supplements. These are supplements based on chloride and sulfur. They essentially modulate metabolism or calcium metabolism in the cow. They basically prime her system to respond to that calcium demand at the time of calving. And so they've been around since the first research was done in the 1980s. They've been around in the industry since the 90s. They're actually quite widely adopted, and that's something that's changed in the Northeast as we become more sensitive or more perceptive of the issues of subclinical hypocalcemia, and that these diets actually do, even when there's not clinical milk fever, get cows off to a better start. The newer kid on the block is these calcium binders, and this is there's one commercial one on the marketplace that would be the one to consider. It's a different approach than DCATs. You're not worried about potassium. You're not feeding anions, things like that. You're not measuring urine pHs. But those also, essentially what it does, it actualizes the low calcium diet, which most of our feeds aren't low enough in calcium to really do that. So the binder helps us get there. And, that's also, we've done work on that, and there's, can be very effective in increasing blood calcium. And I think, for herds that struggle a bit to consistently implement anionic diets, and they have issues with calcium issues in fresh cows, I think, certainly it's a strategy that's worth a look.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that a little bit further. So I also want to quickly go back to our grouping strategy with the close-up and far-off versus one group and transition into dry period length. So what is your ideal recommendation for how long a cow should be dry for? Is there a point where the dry period is too short? Is there a point where it gets too long? And how would you advise producers to navigate that?
Yeah, so, I think, short and dry periods got attention. They still get some attention, but they really got attention a few years ago. And, I think a good general recommendation for dry period length is 50 to 60 days. And that for sure, I think, is where first lactation animals going into second lactation need to be. Now, we've done field research with commercial dairies looking specifically at assigning cows to, say 50 to 60 days dry versus 40. And, what we found is that, older cows, so cows entering second or greater lactation and beyond, you can shorten them, you can manage them down to a 40-day dry period. And they will not really have no effect in the next lactation. You won't lose any milk. Everything else seems to be fine. When we did that with first lactation animals, we lost 4 to 6 pounds of milk in second lactation. So, that again just tells us these first lactation animals need that more traditional dry period length as they go into second lactation. So, whether it relates to just the needs of the mammary gland to continue to grow and develop, or remodel. I'm not totally sure, but again, they do need a little bit that extra time. And obviously we get concerned too. We get to animals at 70, 80, 90, 100 plus days dry, and trying to keep weight off of them during that time frame. And again, another reason why a low energy far off group can be helpful. Or potentially, depending on the herd and the animal, maybe one of the pregnant heifer groups, right? The energy may be low enough there to also, maybe be a good place for that animal. But it really just depends on the space.
Yeah, I know during the COVID-19 pandemic and milk production decreases, a strategy was to dry cows off early. So I think you brought up some really important points for producers to consider if they are going to adapt a longer dry period, just to make sure, those cows aren't at risk of gaining too much body condition and that far off diet is managed correctly. So I think you brought up some really great points there. So Tom, I want to switch gears a little bit and shift away from nutritional management and talk about some of the non-nutritional factors that also play a role in the dry period. So things like stocking density, and then grouping maybe more in terms of parity differences, and then heat stress. Are you able to touch a little bit on each of those?
Yeah, so that's the non-nutritional factors are really important, and Casey, they can, I can formulate the best diet on paper. Farms can implement them with your feeding management recommendations, and yet, if we're overstocked, if we have issues with frequent group changes through transition, if we have heat stress, we're going to probably derail a bunch of that. And so, I think our herds are doing better in this area. I think we used to have lots of dairies where, these dry cow pens or pre-fresh pens were 3-row pens stocked at, 130% of stalls, which meant maybe 12 inches of bunk space or less. And, I think herds are doing a lot better at giving them that 24 to 30 inches of bunk space and a place to lay down both pre and post calving if they have fresh groups. That also really benefits the heifers. The stocking density thing, it benefits the cows when we're able to control that stocking density, but it really benefits the heifers if they're housed in the same group. As dairies grow, we encourage them to consider, are there ways they can actually house the first or the heifers and the cows separately through transition, both sides. That's easier said than done on a lot of dairies, but again, I think it's a way where the heifers can really benefit from that in terms of their lack of having to compete with older cows. I think we've also done a good job overall getting away from some of the frequent group changes in transition. And I remember herds used to change from a close-up group to a closer-up group, like at 5 to 7 to 10 days before calving. And invariably, those herds had more issues. And I think we need to remember that that's the time, when cows' intakes are decreasing already. And so you switch groups on them, and that's only further going to happen. And so, a lot of herds have gone to more kind of a just-in-time type calving. So they're in that close-up group for about 21 days, and then really only get to a calving pen for a number of hours, et cetera. And that seems to work pretty well. And then we also, even in our world, heat stress. It seems strange as we sit here in March to think about this, but heat stress during the dry period actually has profound effects on the cow and her calf. So lower milk yield in the cow. Immune issues, potentially with absorption of cholesterol antibodies in the calf. And actually those calves that are at Florida work out of Jeff Dahl's group, which is really cool, would show that, that are really interesting anyway. And it says we need to be cool. But these calves born to heat stress dams during the dry period, mothers are heat stress during the dry period, they make 11 or 12 pounds less milk in first lactation. 2 years later, these animals are making less milk if they were heat stressed when they were in utero before they were born. So pretty wild. But again, I think still opportunities for us to continue to keep improving this whole transition management system here in New York and other parts of the Northeast.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think you brought up, again, some really great points, and it all comes back to what you said earlier. We can formulate the best diet, but there's more management factors that go into it than just the diet that is formulated on paper. And some of those non-nutritional factors that you just discussed really do play a big role. So I think it's a good reminder for producers to hear. So just as we wrap up, I want to give you the opportunity, and then maybe from a feeding management standpoint, I can touch on it also. But can you give some listeners a couple of take-home messages on how we can fine-tune dry period management as it relates to both nutritional and non-nutritional management?
Yeah, well, again, I think it's there's a couple pieces here, right? One is, keep your eye on the ball relative to the big principles you're trying to achieve, right? You're trying to keep energy levels down far off so cows don't gain body condition. You're trying to prep them both in an energy and calcium or decat or calcium management sort of way in the close-up period, so that when they calve, they're ready to go. That you'll talk about the feeding management stuff, the non-nutritional side, controlling those factors, being consistent about it. Right. And Casey, from your end, what's key for them to do on the feeding management side?
I think really just providing a diet that is going to promote intake in the dry period is really important. So one of the things with these controlled energy dry cow diets that contain a lot of straw is that unfortunately cows don't love straw. So I think we need to implement strategies from a feeding management perspective. So whether it's minimizing the forage particle size, adding water, or making the diet more palatable through the use of molasses, I think it's really important that the diet that we provide to the cows is desirable to the cows. And that's going to get them to eat more during the dry period, especially in that week leading up to calving. And then I think ultimately that's just going to promote better metabolic health after calving.
Yeah, great points. And I think the last thing is dairies I've worked with over time that do really, really well in transition. I think that the dairies that recognize that all these areas are important, and they're always trying to do just a little bit better today than they did yesterday in these things, right? And it's kind of a slow and steady improvement, but it shows up in terms of better, certainly better health, but then also better milk and milk component yield, better reproductive performance, and all the things that kind of make things go around from the standpoint of managing dairies and managing cows.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you very much, Tom. I really appreciate you joining me today to discuss the dry period on this particular podcast episode. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to our final episode in the Troubleshooting Herd Health series. If you require more information, please reach out to your local dairy specialist or Pro Dairy for more information.
Thanks for listening to this Herd Health Troubleshooting episode. You can find more episodes like this one on the CCE Dairy Educator channel on SoundCloud or on the Pro Dairy website, along with many other resources.